The winter wind howled through the streets of Redemption Creek, Montana Territory, 1879, carrying snow that bit at exposed skin like tiny needles. But Penelope Morgan hardly noticed as she clutched her carpetbag tighter and surveyed the dusty Main Street. She had traveled too far, sacrificed too much to be intimidated by a little bad weather or the curious stares of the townspeople who seldom saw a lone woman arrive on the afternoon stage. Redemption Creek had not been her first choice or even her second, but after fleeing St. Louis with little more than the clothes on her back and the modest inheritance her grandmother had left her, options were limited. The advertisement seeking a schoolteacher had promised decent wages and accommodations, enough to start over where no one knew her name or the scandal that had driven her away. "Madam, you planning on standing there till spring?" The stagecoach driver chuckled, handing down her second bag. "Town ain't much to look at, but it beats freezing to death." Penelope straightened her shoulders beneath her worn wool coat. "Thank you for your concern, but I'm quite all right." She offered a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes, the same expression she had perfected over the last year, revealing nothing while appearing polite. The driver shrugged and climbed back onto his seat, leaving her alone on the wooden sidewalk. She glanced at the hand-drawn map the mayor had included with his letter of employment and oriented herself toward what would be her new home and schoolhouse. As she navigated the muddy street, Penelope noted the standard establishments of a frontier town: general store, a Sayers office, saloon, and a small church. Men in dusty clothes and worn hats paused their conversations to watch her pass, their gazes lingering longer than proper. She kept her eyes forward, her pace steady. She had learned the hard way that in this world, a woman alone was seen as either prey or conquest. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a simple clapboard building with a small attached living quarters. It looked weathered but solid, not unlike herself, she thought wryly. As she approached, she noticed a tall figure working on the roof, hammering down shingles with practiced efficiency. The man must have heard her footsteps, for he paused and looked down. Even from below, she could see that his face was tanned and weathered beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. He studied her for a moment before setting down his hammer and making his way to the edge of the roof with easy grace. "You must be the new schoolmarm," he called down, his voice deep and resonant. Without waiting for a response, he swung himself over the edge and dropped to the ground with the agility of someone who had spent his life in physical labor. Up close, he was even taller than she'd first thought, standing at least a head above her own 5 feet 4 inches. His shoulders were broad beneath his woolen shirt, his lean frame suggesting a man who worked hard for his living. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a clear, striking blue that seemed to see right through the careful mask she wore. "Nathan Blackwell," he said, extending a gloved hand. "Town council asked me to make sure the place was in decent shape before you arrived." When she hesitated, his mouth quirked slightly. "Don't worry, madam. My hands are clean under these gloves, mostly." "Penelope Morgan," she replied, briefly taking his offered hand. His grip was firm but gentle, calloused even through the leather. "I wasn't expecting a welcoming committee." "Hardly that," Nathan replied, releasing her hand and gesturing toward the roof. "Just finishing up some repairs. Winter's coming early this year, and the last thing you need is snow coming through the ceiling while you're trying to teach the young'uns their letters." She nodded, unsure how to respond to his matter-of-fact kindness. In her experience, men rarely did anything without expecting something in return. "I appreciate the consideration, Mr. Blackwell. Most folks just call me Nate." He studied her face, his gaze thoughtful. "You've come a long way to teach in a place like this." It wasn't a question, but she felt compelled to answer anyway. "I go where the work is. Don't we all?" He retrieved a key from his pocket and handed it to her. "Mayor asked me to give you this. It's for both Door's schoolhouse and your quarters. They're connected, but each has its own entrance." Their fingers brushed as she took the key, and she pulled back perhaps too quickly. If he noticed her discomfort, he didn't comment. "I've got a few more shingles to put down," he said, nodding toward the roof. "Should be done before sundown. There's firewood stacked by your door, enough to get you through a few days at least." "Thank you," she said, suddenly aware of how tired she was after days of travel. "I won't keep you from your work." Nate studied her for a moment longer, then tipped his hat. "Welcome to Redemption Creek, Miss Morgan." As she unlocked the door to her new home, Penelope couldn't help but glance back at the tall cowboy who had already climbed back onto the roof. She firmly pushed away the unbidden thought that his eyes were the color of the summer sky she'd left behind. Inside, the quarters were simple but clean: a small bedroom, a sitting area with a stone fireplace, and a modest kitchen space with a pump sink. The previous teacher had left some furniture: a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a table with 2 chairs, and a rocking chair by the fireplace. Penelope set down her bags and removed her coat and bonnet. She would unpack later. For now, she needed to gather her thoughts and remind herself why she was here. Redemption Creek was not a destination. It was merely a temporary stop, a place to rebuild her savings and her reputation before moving on to somewhere larger, somewhere she could truly disappear. She walked to the small window and watched as Nathan Blackwell worked steadily on the roof, his movements sure and efficient. Men like him were dangerous not because they threatened physical harm, but because they offered kindness without apparent motive, the kind of kindness that might tempt a person to trust again. And trust was a luxury Penelope Morgan could no longer afford. The first day of school arrived with a flurry of activity. 15 children of varying ages filed into the schoolhouse, their faces a mixture of curiosity and wariness as they assessed their new teacher. Penelope had spent the weekend preparing lessons and familiarizing herself with the modest collection of books available. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and composed. "My name is Miss Morgan and I will be your teacher." A small girl in the front row raised her hand immediately. "Yes." Penelope acknowledged her with a nod. "My pa says you're from the city. Is that why you talk so fancy?" Several children giggled, and Penelope felt a smile tugging at her lips despite herself. "I was born in Boston and lived most recently in St. Louis. And I wasn't aware that I spoke fancy, but I'll take that as a compliment." The morning progressed smoothly as she assessed the children's education levels and divided them into appropriate groups. The older boys were the most resistant, clearly believing themselves too grown for schooling, but she had dealt with reluctant students before. At noon, she rang the small bell on her desk. "You may take your lunch hour now. We'll resume at 1 o'clock sharp." As the children spilled out into the yard, Penelope sank into her chair with a sigh. Teaching was familiar ground, something she could lose herself in without the constant vigilance she maintained in other aspects of her life. A knock at the open door interrupted her thoughts. Nathan Blackwell stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking somewhat out of place in the schoolroom with his tall frame and rugged appearance. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, rising from her seat, "is there something I can help you with?" "Just checking that everything's holding up," he replied, gesturing vaguely toward the ceiling. "No leaks or drafts after the snow last night. Everything is fine, thank you." She folded her hands at her waist, maintaining the professional distance she'd established during their first meeting. He nodded and she thought he might leave, but instead he took a step into the room. "I brought you something." From behind his back, he produced a small wooden box. "Town doesn't have a proper library, but I thought these might be useful." Penelope approached cautiously and opened the box to find a collection of books, some classics she recognized, others clearly chosen for younger readers. "These are from your personal collection?" she asked, surprised by the gesture. "Some were my mother's. She was a teacher back east before she married my father and came west." His expression softened with the memory. "She always said books were windows to worlds you might never see otherwise." Penelope ran her fingers over the spine of a well-worn copy of the Odyssey. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was." A shadow crossed his face. "Been gone 10 years now. Fever took her and my pa both within a month of each other." "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, and meant it. The pain of losing loved ones was something she understood all too well. Nathan shrugged, but his casual gesture couldn't hide the old grief in his eyes. "Life out here is beautiful but harsh. You learn to take the good with the bad." She returned the books to their box, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Personal histories led to connections, and connections led to vulnerability. "Thank you for the books, Mr. Blackwell. The children will certainly benefit from them." "Nate," he corrected gently. "And you're welcome, Miss Morgan." "The children will be returning soon," she said, glancing out the window where her students were playing in the schoolyard. He took the hint and stepped back toward the door. "Of course, I won't keep you from your duties." He settled his hat back on his head but paused before leaving. "There's a town social on Saturday evening. Folks would like to properly welcome you to Redemption Creek." Penelope hesitated. She had planned to keep her interactions with the townspeople to a minimum outside of her professional duties. "I appreciate the invitation, but it would mean a lot to the parents," he interrupted, his gaze steady. "Folks here want to know who's teaching their children." Put that way, she could hardly refuse without seeming rude or secretive, neither of which would serve her purpose of maintaining a quiet, unremarkable presence in town. "Very well," she conceded. "I'll attend." His smile was quick and genuine, transforming his weathered face into something almost boyish. "Good. I'll stop by around 6 to escort you if that's agreeable." Before she could form a protest, he was gone, leaving her staring at the empty doorway as the children began filing back into the classroom. Throughout the afternoon lessons, Penelope found her thoughts drifting to Nathan Blackwell more often than she cared to admit. There was something disarming about his straightforward manner, as if he had nothing to hide and expected the same from others. That evening, as she sat by her fire grading the first assignments from her students, Penelope reminded herself of the promise she'd made after leaving St. Louis, to guard her heart against the false security of affection. She had learned through bitter experience that even the most sincere declarations of love could turn to ash when reputation and position were threatened. She would attend the social because it was expected of her as the town's teacher. She would be polite to Nathan Blackwell because he had shown her kindness. But she could not allow herself to see him as anything other than a fellow resident of this small, temporary stopping place in her life. With that resolution firmly in mind, she returned to her students' work, pushing away the memory of clear blue eyes and a smile that reached them. Saturday evening arrived too quickly. Penelope stood before the small mirror in her bedroom, assessing her appearance with a critical eye. The dark blue dress was one of the few nice garments she'd brought with her, simple but well-made, with modest lace at the collar and cuffs. She had pinned her chestnut hair in a neat arrangement at the nape of her neck, with a few soft curls framing her face. She looked respectable, appropriate for a schoolteacher attending a community function. That was all that mattered. A knock at her door announced Nathan's arrival precisely at 6 o'clock. She took a deep breath, slipped on her shawl, and went to answer it. Nathan stood on her porch, hat in hand, dressed in what was clearly his best shirt and a clean pair of trousers. His dark hair was neatly combed, and she noticed he had trimmed his beard. The effect was striking. He looked less like a rugged cowboy and more like the kind of man who might escort a lady to a social in a larger town. "Evening, Miss Morgan," he said, his eyes warming as they took in her appearance. "You look lovely." "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell," she replied, deliberately using his formal name despite his previous invitation to call him Nate. If he noticed her continued formality, he didn't comment. "Ready to meet the rest of the town." "As ready as I'll ever be," she said, locking her door behind her. The walk to the town hall was short, and Nathan filled it with easy conversation about the community and its residents. "Sheriff Thompson's wife makes the best apple pie you'll ever taste," he was saying as they approached the brightly lit building. "And Doc Wilson might look like he's ancient as the hills, but his hands are steady as a rock. Delivered most of the children in your classroom." Music and laughter spilled out into the night as they entered the hall. The space was decorated with paper lanterns and autumn leaves, tables laden with food lined one wall, and a small group of musicians played in the corner. Couples were already dancing while others gathered in small groups, talking and laughing. Penelope felt a moment of panic at the sight of so many strangers, all of whom would be curious about her. Nathan seemed to sense her discomfort, for he placed a gentle hand at her elbow. "Just breathe," he said quietly. "They're good people, and they already think highly of you for taking on their children's education." Before she could respond, they were approached by a portly man with a jovial expression. "There she is, our new schoolmarm." He extended a hand to Penelope. "Mayor Frederick Williams, Miss Morgan, so pleased you could join us tonight." "Thank you for the invitation," she replied, shaking his hand with what she hoped was an appropriate smile. "I see Blackwell here has been taking good care of you," the mayor said with a knowing glance at Nathan. "Been fixing up that schoolhouse roof for weeks, making sure everything was just so for your arrival." Penelope glanced at Nathan, who looked slightly uncomfortable. "I'm grateful for Mr. Blackwell's assistance," she said carefully. "Well, come along," Mayor Williams continued, seemingly oblivious to the undercurrents. "Plenty of folks waiting to meet you." The next hour passed in a blur of introductions. Penelope met parents of her students, shopkeepers, the doctor, the sheriff and his wife, and countless others whose names she struggled to remember. Everyone was polite, if curious, and she found herself repeating the same vague story about seeking a change of scenery after teaching in St. Louis. Nathan stayed close by, occasionally offering a quiet word of explanation or introduction when needed. His presence was both reassuring and unsettling. She appreciated not being left alone to navigate the social waters, but was uncomfortably aware of his proximity, of the gentle pressure of his hand at her back when guiding her through the crowd. "You're doing fine," he murmured as they finally broke away from a group of chattering women. "Need some air?" She nodded gratefully, and he led her toward the side door that opened onto a small porch. The night air was crisp but not uncomfortably cold, and Penelope breathed deeply, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Thank you," she said after a moment. "I'm not accustomed to being the center of attention." Nathan leaned against the porch railing, studying her in the soft light spilling from the windows. "You hide it well. Anyone watching would think you're perfectly at ease." "Years of practice," she said without thinking, then wished she could take the words back when his expression turned curious. "What are you running from, Penelope Morgan?" he asked quietly. The use of her full name startled her almost as much as the directness of his question. "I'm not running from anything," she replied too quickly. "I simply sought a change of scenery." "Yes, I heard." His voice was gentle but firm. "Thing is, I've known a fair number of people seeking a change of scenery out here. Most of them are leaving something behind." She turned away from him, staring out into the darkness. "We all have pasts, Mr. Blackwell. Mine is simply not relevant to my position here." "Fair enough," he said after a pause, "and it's still Nate, especially when we're not surrounded by half the town." Despite herself, Penelope felt a small smile tug at her lips. "You're very persistent, so I've been told." There was humor in his voice. "My pa used to say I was stubborn as a mule with a better vocabulary." She turned back to face him, finding it difficult to maintain her guard in the face of his easy charm. "Is that what you are, Mr. Blackwell? Stubborn?" among other things. He straightened from his leaning position against the railing, suddenly closer than she'd expected. "I also believe in second chances. Redemption Creek wasn't named by accident." The music from inside changed to a slower waltz, floating out to where they stood. Nathan extended a hand toward her. "Dance with me?" he asked, his voice low. Every instinct warned her to refuse, to maintain the distance she'd so carefully constructed. But something in his eyes and openness, a lack of guile that she'd rarely encountered in men, made her hesitate. "We can stay right here," he added, as if sensing her reluctance to return to the crowded hall. "Just one dance." Penelope placed her hand in his, telling herself it was merely politeness, merely playing the role expected of her as a newcomer being welcomed to the community. His other hand settled respectfully at her waist, and he led her in a simple waltz pattern on the small porch, his movements surprisingly graceful for such a tall man. They danced in silence for a few moments, the space between them proper but still close enough that she could detect the faint scent of soap and leather that clung to him. "Where did a cowboy learn to dance?" she asked, partly out of genuine curiosity and partly to distract herself from how comfortable it felt in his arms. "My mother," he replied with a small smile, "said every gentleman should know how to properly escort a lady around a dance floor, even if that floor was just our cabin's dirt one." "She sounds remarkable." She was. His eyes grew distant with memory. She never quite adjusted to life out here, but she made the best of it, found beauty in hard places. The waltz was ending, but neither of them immediately pulled away. For a suspended moment, Penelope found herself looking up into his face, illuminated by the soft glow from the windows, and wondered what it would be like to trust someone again, to trust him. The thought startled her back to reality, and she stepped away, breaking the tenuous connection between them. "I should go back inside. People will wonder where I've gone." Nathan studied her face, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he saw more than she wanted him to. "Of course," he said finally, offering his arm. "Shall we?" They rejoined the celebration, and Penelope was careful to maintain a proper distance for the remainder of the evening. She danced with the mayor, with the father of one of her students, with the elderly doctor who told her delightful stories about the town's early days. But she did not dance with Nathan again, though she was acutely aware of his presence across the room, of his eyes occasionally finding hers in the crowd. When the evening drew to a close, he walked her home as promised. Their conversation was polite but impersonal: the weather, the success of the social, her impressions of the townspeople. At her door, he removed his hat and waited as she unlocked it. "Thank you for escorting me," she said formally, standing in the doorway. "My pleasure," he replied, his voice warm despite the coolness she had maintained since their dance. "Good night, Penelope." The use of her given name sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. "Good night, Mr. Blackwell," she responded, deliberately maintaining the formality between them. A shadow of something disappointment perhaps crossed his face, but he merely nodded and stepped back. "Sleep well." Penelope closed the door and leaned against it, listening to his retreating footsteps. Her heart was beating too fast, and she pressed a hand against it, as if she could physically contain the unwelcome emotions threatening to breach the walls she had so carefully constructed. "Foolish," she whispered to herself in the darkness of her small home. Utterly foolish. She had not come to Redemption Creek to form attachments. She had come to hide, to heal, to forget. Nathan Blackwell, with his kind eyes and gentle hands, was a complication she could not afford. With that stern reminder, Penelope lit her lamp and prepared for bed, determined to put the evening and the tall cowboy with the summer sky eyes firmly behind her. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm. Penelope taught during the day, prepared lessons in the evening, and kept largely to herself outside of school hours. She attended church on Sundays, exchanged pleasantries with the townspeople when she visited the general store, and politely declined invitations to Sunday dinners or afternoon teas. Nathan Blackwell made no further attempts to escort her anywhere, though she occasionally saw him around town or speaking with the children after school. He was unfailingly polite when their paths crossed, tipping his hat and asking after her well-being, but he respected the distance she had established. She told herself this was exactly what she wanted, to fulfill her duties without complications or entanglements. Yet she found herself watching for him when she walked to and from the schoolhouse, and felt an inexplicable disappointment on the days when he didn't appear. As winter deepened, heavy snow blanketed Redemption Creek. The children arrived at school red-cheeked and stamping snow from their boots, and Penelope kept the fire in the schoolroom stoked high against the bitter cold. One particularly harsh afternoon, as she was dismissing the students, 9-year-old Emma Thompson tugged at her sleeve. "Miss Morgan," the girl said urgently, "Pa says there's a big storm coming tonight. He sent our wagon to fetch me and said to tell you that you should come with us. It ain't safe to be out at the edge of town when the blizzard hits." Penelope glanced out the window at the darkening sky. The snow was already falling more heavily than it had been at midday. "That's very kind of your father, Emma, but I'll be fine here. I have plenty of supplies." "But Pa says, Emma," Sheriff Thompson called from the doorway where he stood stamping snow from his boots. "You ready, girl?" "Yes, Pa, but Miss Morgan won't come with us," Emma reported with a child's directness. The sheriff approached, his expression concerned. "Miss Morgan, I don't mean to alarm you, but this storm's looking to be the worst of the season. Your place is pretty isolated out here." "I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, but I have firewood, food, and plenty of blankets," she assured him. "I've weathered storms before." He looked unconvinced but nodded reluctantly. "If you're certain, just keep your doors locked and the fire going. These prairie blizzards are nothing to take lightly." After they left, Penelope went about securing the schoolhouse, banking the fire there before retreating to her quarters. She checked her supplies, enough food for several days, plenty of firewood stacked by the hearth, water in the barrel by the sink, and tried to ignore the growing howl of the wind outside. By evening, the storm had intensified beyond anything she had anticipated. The wind shrieked around the corners of the small building, finding every crack and crevice to send icy drafts skittering across the floor. Snow piled against the windows, and despite her best efforts, the temperature in her small home dropped steadily. Penelope huddled before the fire, wrapped in every blanket she owned, and tried to convince herself that she'd made the right decision in refusing the Thompsons' offer of shelter. Pride, she thought grimly, was a poor companion on a night like this. A sudden pounding at her door made her jump. For a moment she thought it might be the wind tearing at the building, but then it came again, deliberate, human. She approached cautiously, mindful of the sheriff's warning to keep her doors locked. "Who's there?" she called through the wooden panel. "Nate Blackwell," came the muffled reply. "Let me in, Penelope. It's freezing out here." Relief and wariness warred within her as she unlocked the door. Nathan burst in with a gust of snow and frigid air, his hat and coat white with accumulation, his face red from the cold. "What are you doing here?" she demanded as she quickly shut the door against the storm. He removed his hat, sending snow cascading to her floor. "Checking on you," he said, his voice gruff with concern. "Thompson said you refused to come to town." "As I told the sheriff, I'm perfectly capable of freezing to death alone," he interrupted, his blue eyes flashing with something that looked suspiciously like anger. "This isn't stubbornness, Penelope, it's foolishness." She drew herself up, affronted. "I did not ask for your opinion, Mr. Blackwell, nor did I request your presence." "No, you didn't," he agreed, his expression softening slightly as he took in her blanket-wrapped form and the meager fire. "But here I am anyway." Without waiting for permission, he moved to the fireplace and examined it critically. "Your chimney's partially blocked with snow, that's why it's not drawing properly." He turned to the woodpile and selected several large logs. "We need to get this burning hotter." Penelope watched as he expertly rebuilt the fire, coaxing it from smoldering embers to a robust blaze that immediately began to warm the small space. He worked efficiently, removing his snow-covered coat only after the fire was tended. "You rode out in this weather just to check on me?" she asked finally, the realization sinking in that he had put himself at considerable risk. Nathan straightened from the hearth, brushing his hands on his trousers. "I did. That was very reckless of you," she said, but the words held no real reproach. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Probably, but I wouldn't have been able to sleep knowing you were out here alone in this." He gestured toward the windows, where snow continued to batter against the glass. The simple honesty of his statement caught her off guard. Here was a man who had ridden through a blizzard, risking his own safety because he was concerned for hers. Not because he wanted anything from her, not because of obligation or duty, but simply because he cared. It was a concept so foreign to her recent experience that she hardly knew how to respond. "Thank you," she said finally, the words inadequate but sincere. He nodded, then moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. "Storm's not letting up." "I should check your roof, make sure snow's not piling up too heavy on it." "You can't go back out in that," she protested. "Just to the woodshed where I left my horse. There's a ladder there." He was already pulling his coat back on. "I'll be quick." Before she could argue further, he was gone, leaving her staring at the door. True to his word, he returned within minutes, snow-covered but bearing an armful of additional firewood. "Roof's holding for now," he reported, stacking the wood by the hearth. "I cleared some of the snow from the worst spots." He removed his coat again, and Penelope noticed he was shivering despite his efforts to hide it. "You're freezing," she said, concern overriding her usual reserve. "Come sit by the fire." Nathan didn't argue, settling onto the small rug before the hearth. Penelope hesitated, then sat beside him, offering one of her blankets. Their fingers brushed as he accepted it, and she felt a jolt that had nothing to do with the cold. "I can't go back to town tonight," he said after a moment, his eyes on the flames. "Not in this weather. I hope that won't compromise your reputation too severely." There was a touch of wry humor in his voice, but Penelope heard the genuine concern beneath it. "I think my reputation will survive," she replied. "Especially since you likely saved me from a rather uncomfortable night, if not worse." They sat in silence for a while, the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind the only sounds. Penelope was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the solid warmth of him, the faint scent of leather and horses that clung to his clothes, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Why did you really come to Redemption Creek?" he asked suddenly, his voice quiet but clear. She stiffened, the familiar walls sliding into place. "I told you you were seeking a change of scenery." "Yes." He turned to look at her, his gaze steady and searching. "But that's not the whole truth, is it? Perhaps it was the storm raging outside, isolating them from the rest of the world. Perhaps it was the exhaustion of maintaining her guard for so long. Or perhaps it was simply the way he looked at her, not with judgment or expectation, but with genuine interest in who she truly was. Whatever the reason, Penelope found herself speaking words she had not uttered to another living soul since leaving St. Louis. "I was engaged," she said, her eyes fixed on the flames, "to a man from a prominent family. Edward was charming, educated, everything a woman is supposed to want in a husband. My parents were thrilled they had died years before, but my aunt who raised me was determined to see me well settled." She paused, the memories still sharp enough to cut. "There was a child at the school where I taught, a bright little boy, but he had a difficulty with reading. The other teachers thought him slow, but I realized he simply saw letters differently than most. I spent extra time with him, developed methods to help him learn in his own way." Nathan listened silently, his expression encouraging her to continue. "His father was so grateful that he hosted a dinner in my honor, inviting several influential people from the school board. He toasted my innovative teaching methods, suggested the school adopt them more widely." A bitter smile touched her lips. Edward was there. He seemed proud at first, but afterward he told me I had embarrassed him, that his fiancée should not be drawing attention to herself, especially not for something as common as teaching. That once we were married, I would of course give up such work entirely. "What did you do?" Nathan asked when she fell silent. "I refused," she said simply. "I told him I had no intention of abandoning my profession, that my work with children was not some passing fancy but my life's calling." She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the worst part of the story. "He ended our engagement the next day, publicly. Claimed he had discovered unseemly behavior on my part that made me an unsuitable wife. He never specified what this behavior was, which only made people imagine the worst." He lied, Nathan said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Oh yes, she confirmed. But it hardly mattered. His family's standing in the community was unassailable. My reputation was ruined. The school board suggested it might be best for all concerned if I sought employment elsewhere. She finally looked at him, expecting to see pity or, worse, disbelief. Instead, his expression held a quiet rage on her behalf and something else, a respect that warmed her more than the fire before them. So you came west, he said, where no one knew your name or the lies told about you. Yes. She wrapped her arms around her knees, suddenly feeling exposed. Now you know why I keep to myself, why I can't afford to form attachments here. If anyone were to discover my history, they'd discover a woman of principle who refused to abandon her calling, Nathan interrupted. Who chose integrity over an advantageous marriage. Penelope shook her head. That's a generous interpretation, but not how most would see it. It's how I see it, he said firmly, and it's how anyone worth knowing would see it too. She wanted desperately to believe him, to accept the understanding he offered without reservation. But fear, the constant companion of the past year, held her back. Thank you for listening, she said finally, rising from her place by the fire. It's late and we should try to get some rest. You can take the bed, I'll make a pallet here by the fire. I'll take the floor, he countered, standing as well. I've slept in far worse conditions. She started to argue, then realized it would be pointless. Nathan Blackwell might be many things, but he was not a man who would take a woman's bed while she slept on the floor, regardless of propriety or practicality. Very well, she conceded, gathering some extra blankets from her chest. Here, at least make yourself comfortable. Their hands met over the blankets, and this time, neither pulled away immediately. For a long moment, they stood close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from him. Thank you for trusting me with your story, he said quietly. She nodded, unable to find words for the confusing emotions swirling within her. Finally, she stepped back, breaking the connection. Good night, Mr. Blackwell, she said, retreating to the safety of formality. A small smile played at his lips. Good night, Miss Morgan. As she lay in her narrow bed, listening to the storm and the occasional creak of floorboards as Nathan moved to tend the fire, Penelope wondered if she had made a terrible mistake in revealing so much of herself to him. Yet alongside the fear was a curious lightness, as if sharing her burden had somehow diminished its weight. She drifted to sleep with the comforting knowledge that, at least for tonight, she was not alone. Morning arrived with blinding whiteness. The storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine snow that sparkled in the sunlight. Penelope woke to the smell of coffee and the quiet sounds of movement in her small kitchen. Nathan stood at her stove, his back to her as he tended something in a pan. He had already built up the fire and the cottage was pleasantly warm after the chill of the night. Good morning, she said, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders as she emerged from the bedroom. He turned, a smile warming his face. Morning. Hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of making breakfast. Figured we could both use something hot after last night. I didn't know cowboys could cook, she said, approaching to inspect his efforts. A pan of golden cornbread sat on the stove alongside a pot of what smelled like beans with bacon. We can't all survive on beef jerky and coffee, he replied with a chuckle. My mother insisted I learn the basics before she'd let me work the range with my father. The domesticity of the scene struck Penelope suddenly, the two of them in her small kitchen, the shared meal, the easy conversation. It felt dangerously comfortable, like a glimpse into a life she had never allowed herself to imagine. The storm's passed, she observed, moving to the window to break the moment. The children won't be able to make it to school today, though, not with snow this deep. Town will be digging out for a day or two, Nathan agreed, serving the simple breakfast onto 2 plates, but the sun's strong. It'll melt faster than you'd think. They ate at her small table, and Penelope was surprised to find herself enjoying the company. Without the pressure of prying eyes or social expectations, conversation flowed more easily between them. Nathan told her about his ranch a few miles outside of town, about the horses he bred and trained, about his plans to expand once the spring came. "Why Redemption Creek?" she asked, curious about what had brought him to this particular corner of Montana. "My father helped found the town," he explained. "He was one of the first settlers in the valley, had a vision of what this place could become." A shadow passed over his face. "He didn't live to see much of it realized, but I figured I owed it to him to try. And your mother." Did she share his vision? Nathan's smile was tinged with sadness. "She followed him because she loved him. Never complained, even when I know she missed her family back east, missed the comforts of civilization." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "She used to say that home wasn't a place, it was the people you chose to build your life around." The words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. After breakfast, Nathan insisted on checking the roof once more and clearing a path from her door to the schoolhouse before he left. Penelope watched from the doorway as he worked, his breath forming clouds in the cold air, his movements sure and efficient. "That should hold you until the main road gets cleared," he said finally, returning to where she stood. His cheeks were ruddy from exertion and cold, his eyes bright against the backdrop of snow. "Thank you," she said, meaning it for more than just the path he'd cleared. "For everything." He studied her face for a long moment, then reached out slowly, as if giving her time to pull away, and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers were cold against her cheek, but his touch sent warmth curling through her. "I should go," he said, his voice lower than usual. "Check on my ranch, make sure everything weathered the storm." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Nathan stepped back, retrieving his hat from where it hung by her door. "I'll come by tomorrow, make sure you're doing all right." "That's not necessary," she protested automatically. A smile tugged at his mouth. "Probably not, but I'll come anyway if that's all right with you." She should refuse. Should maintain the distance that had protected her since her arrival. Should not allow this man any further into the life she had so carefully constructed. "Yes," she heard herself say instead. "That would be all right." His smile widened, transforming his face. "Tomorrow, then." Penelope watched from her doorway as he mounted his horse and rode away, a solitary figure against the vast whiteness of the snow-covered landscape. Only when he had disappeared from view did she close the door, leaning against it as she tried to make sense of the conflicting emotions within her. Fear was still there, the fear of trusting, of being vulnerable, of potential heartbreak. But alongside it, growing stronger with each encounter, was something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Hope. True to his word, Nathan returned the next day and the next. He brought news from town, helped clear more snow from around the schoolhouse, and stayed for tea or coffee depending on the hour. Their conversations ranged from books they had read to childhood memories to his plans for spring planting. He never pressed her for more personal revelations, seeming content to let her share at her own pace. When school resumed, he sometimes appeared at the end of the day, ostensibly to check on the building but clearly seeking her company. The children noticed. Of course, nothing escaped their observant eyes, and Penelope endured good-natured teasing from her older students about Mr. Blackwell's frequent inspections. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the walls she had built around her heart began to crumble. She found herself looking forward to his visits, missing him when several days passed without his appearance, thinking of things to tell him when next they met. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. As winter gave way to the first tentative signs of spring, Penelope realized with a start that she had been in Redemption Creek for nearly 6 months. The thought brought with it a surprising revelation. She no longer thought of the town as a temporary stopping place. Somewhere along the way, it had begun to feel like home. One mild Saturday in early April, Nathan arrived at her door with an unexpected proposal. "I'd like to show you something," he said when she greeted him. "If you're willing to take a ride with me." Penelope hesitated. They had never ventured beyond the confines of the town together. "Where to? My ranch," he replied. "It's about an hour's ride. The wildflowers are starting to bloom in the valley, and there's a view I think you might appreciate." The invitation represented a significant step beyond their carefully maintained boundaries. Going to his home, spending time alone with him away from the relative safety of the town, it was improper by any standard of propriety. Yet looking at him standing on her porch, his expression open and hopeful, Penelope found she didn't care about propriety as much as she once had. "I'd like that," she said simply. His face lit up with pleasure. "I brought a horse for you, one of my gentlest mares. We can leave whenever you're ready." The ride to Nathan's ranch took them through rolling hills and meadows where, true to his word, the first wildflowers of spring created patches of color against the new grass. He pointed out landmarks along the way, a distinctive rock formation, a creek that ran full in spring but dried to a trickle by summer's end, a stand of aspens that would turn golden in the fall. "There it is," he said finally, reining his horse to a stop at the crest of a hill. "Blackwell Ranch." Below them stretched a picturesque valley. A sturdy log house stood near a large barn and several corrals where horses grazed peacefully. Beyond, fenced pastures extended toward distant mountains still capped with snow. It was beautiful in a rugged, untamed way that perfectly suited the man beside her. "It's lovely," she said, genuinely impressed. "How much of this did you build yourself?" "Most of it," he admitted. "The original cabin was my father's, but I expanded the house, built the barn, put up most of the fencing." There was quiet pride in his voice. "Took years, but it's finally becoming what I envisioned." They rode down to the ranch where Nathan showed her around the property. The house was simple but well built, with a large stone fireplace and windows that caught the afternoon light. It was sparsely furnished but spotlessly clean, with touches of bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes, a handmade quilt on the back of a chair that spoke of a home rather than merely a place to sleep. "My mother's," he explained when he caught her examining the quilt. "One of the few things I have left of hers." After the tour, they rode to the spot he had particularly wanted to show her, a high meadow overlooking both his ranch and the distant town of Redemption Creek. They dismounted, and Nathan spread a blanket on the ground where they could sit and enjoy the view. "I come here sometimes when I need to think," he said as they settled on the blanket. "Something about seeing everything from a distance helps put problems in perspective." Penelope understood what he meant. From here, the vastness of the landscape made human concerns seem smaller, more manageable. The endless sky, the distant mountains, the rolling hills all reminded her that her own troubles were but a tiny part of a much greater whole. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said quietly. "It's peaceful." Nathan was watching her, a warmth in his gaze that made her pulse quicken. "You fit here," he said simply, "in a way I didn't expect when you first arrived." She looked away, uncertain how to respond to the implied compliment. "I've grown fond of Redemption Creek," she admitted, "more than I anticipated." "And its residents?" he asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. "Have any of them grown on you as well?" Penelope met his gaze, knowing they had reached a moment of decision. She could retreat behind her walls, maintain the careful distance she had established for her protection. Or she could take a risk, perhaps the greatest she had ever contemplated. "One in particular," she said softly. The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual at first, then brilliant with joy. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he reached for her hand, entwining his fingers with hers. "I've been falling in love with you since the day you arrived," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Even when you were doing your best to keep me at arm's length." The words sent a shock through her, both terror and exhilaration. "Nathan, I don't know if I can be what you want." "My past is just that, the past," he interrupted gently. "I don't care about the lies some fool told in St. Louis. I care about the woman you are, Penelope, the one who teaches children with patience and kindness, who faces blizzards with courage, who's been afraid to trust but is braver than she gives herself credit for." Tears pricked at her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. "And if my reputation follows me here, if it damages yours by association, then we'll weather that storm together," he said with the same steady confidence he brought to everything. "But it won't matter because the people here know you now, they respect you. They've seen your character and how you care for their children, how you've become part of this community despite your best efforts to remain apart from it." A small laugh escaped her at his accurate assessment. "I did try very hard to keep everyone at a distance, didn't I?" "You did," he agreed with a smile. "And yet here we are." Here they were indeed sitting on a hillside overlooking the valley, hands entwined, the air between them charged with possibility. Penelope felt as if she stood at the edge of a precipice, terrified to jump yet equally terrified not to. "I can't promise I won't be afraid," she said finally, "that the past won't sometimes haunt me." "I'm not asking for perfection," Nathan replied. "Just a chance to show you that love doesn't have to come with conditions or expectations. That it can simply be a gift, freely given and freely received." The simplicity of his declaration, the absence of grand promises or flowery sentiments, touched her more deeply than elaborate professions of devotion ever could. This was Nathan straightforward, honest, offering his heart without artifice or agenda. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would like that chance very much." The kiss, when it came, was gentle at first, a question rather than a demand. His hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. Penelope leaned into his touch, allowing herself to truly feel for the first time in what seemed like forever. When they finally parted, the look in his eyes, tender, reverent, full of promise, made her heart swell with an emotion she had forbidden herself for too long. "I should get you back to town," he said reluctantly, brushing a strand of hair from her face, "before people start to talk." She smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Let them talk," she replied, surprising herself with her own boldness. "I find I don't care nearly as much as I once did." Nathan laughed, the sound rich and warm in the afternoon sunlight. "There's the spirit I always knew was hiding behind those walls of yours." They rode back to town as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the land. The conversation flowed easily between them, punctuated by comfortable silences and occasional touches, his hand reaching for hers, her shoulder brushing against his as their horses walked side by side. At her door, he kissed her once more, a promise of things to come. "Have dinner with me tomorrow?" he asked. "At the hotel restaurant where everyone can see us together." It was a deliberate statement, she knew, a public declaration of his intentions, a way of telling the town that their relationship had changed. "Yes," she agreed, her heart full. "I would like that very much." As she watched him ride away, Penelope realized that for the first time since leaving St. Louis, she was looking forward to tomorrow not with dread or resignation, but with joy. Spring blossomed fully across the Montana landscape, bringing with it longer days and the vibrant renewal of life after winter's dormancy. In Redemption Creek, the change of seasons was marked by increased activity, gardens being planted, houses repaired after winter's damage, new construction beginning on lots that had stood empty through the cold months. For Penelope, the spring brought changes of a more personal nature. Her relationship with Nathan flourished in the open, no longer confined to brief visits or chance encounters. They attended church together on Sundays, took picnic lunches by the creek on pleasant afternoons, and dined at the hotel restaurant regularly enough that the owner began to save their table by the window. The townspeople accepted their courtship with varying degrees of interest and approval. Most seemed genuinely happy for them, particularly the parents of Penelope's students who had come to respect her teaching abilities and care for their children. A few older ladies raised eyebrows at the relatively rapid progression of their relationship, but even their gossip lacked real malice. Nathan divided his time between his ranch and town, often riding in at the end of the school day to escort Penelope on walks or simply to sit with her on the porch of her small home as the evening settled around them. They talked for hours about books, about his plans for the ranch, about her ideas for expanding the school curriculum. Sometimes they spoke of deeper things, her lingering fears of being truly vulnerable, his grief over his parents' deaths, their shared hopes for the future. In those quiet conversations, the bonds between them strengthened beyond mere attraction into something more enduring. On a warm evening in late May, as they sat on her porch watching fireflies emerge in the gathering dusk, Nathan took her hand in his. "I have something to ask you," he said, his voice carrying an undercurrent of nervousness she had rarely heard from him. Penelope's heart quickened. "What is it?" He turned to face her, his expression serious yet tender. "These past months have been the happiest of my life. You've brought something to my days that I didn't even know was missing until you arrived." "Nathan," she began, but he shook his head gently. "Please, let me finish before I lose my nerve." He took a deep breath. "I know it hasn't been long by most standards. And I know you came here seeking independence, not this. But I love you, Penelope Morgan. I love your strength, your kindness, your dedication to your students. I love how you fought to protect your heart, and I'm humbled that you've chosen to share it with me." From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet pouch. "This was my mother's," he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band set with a small, perfect diamond. "My father gave it to her when they decided to come west together. He said it was a promise that no matter where life took them, they would face it as one." Penelope's eyes filled with tears as the meaning of his words became clear. Nathan slid from the porch swing to kneel before her, the ring held between them like a bridge between past and future. "I'm asking if you'll face life with me, Penelope. As my wife, my partner, the mother of our children someday, if you want that. Will you marry me?" Time seemed to suspend itself as 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. Images of her previous engagement flashed before her, the social expectations, the gradual realization that Edward had wanted a possession rather than a partner, the public humiliation of his rejection. But Nathan was not Edward. He had never asked her to be less than she was, had never suggested that her calling as a teacher was somehow beneath him or inappropriate. He had seen her at her most guarded and her most vulnerable, and had loved her through all of it, and she loved him completely, without reservation. The realization settled over her with the certainty of sunrise after a long night. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Nathan, I will marry you." His face transformed with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her rather than for a woman she had never met, but whose legacy lived on in the man before her. Nathan rose and pulled her to her feet, gathering her into an embrace that felt like coming home after a long journey. When he kissed her, Penelope poured all her newfound certainty into her response, holding nothing back. "When?" he asked when they finally parted, both breathless and smiling. "Soon," she replied without hesitation. "I don't want to wait." They decided on a June wedding, a time when the valley would be at its most beautiful and the school term would have ended. Word spread quickly through the small town, and Penelope found herself the recipient of congratulations and offers of assistance from women who had once kept a polite distance. Mrs. Thompson insisted on hosting a small gathering for the ladies of Redemption Creek to help plan the details. To Penelope's surprise, she found herself enjoying the camaraderie, the shared excitement over fabric samples and flower arrangements. These women accepted her as one of their own, not because of her background or connections, but simply because she was to marry a man they respected and become a permanent part of their community. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, with a sky so blue it rivaled the color of Nathan's eyes. The ceremony was held in the small church, which had been decorated with wildflowers gathered by Penelope's students. She wore a gown of ivory silk that Mrs. Williams, the mayor's wife, had helped her select from a catalog and alter to fit perfectly. As she walked down the short aisle on the arm of Sheriff Thompson, who had graciously offered to give her away, Penelope's eyes remained fixed on Nathan. He stood tall and handsome in a new suit, his expression a mixture of awe and adoration that made her heart swell with joy. The vows were simple and sincere, spoken in voices that carried clearly through the hushed church. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Nathan's kiss was both tender and passionate, a promise of the life they would build together. The celebration afterward was held on the grounds of the school, with tables set up under the trees and food contributed by nearly every household in town. There was music and dancing, laughter and a few happy tears, as the community celebrated not just a wedding but the union of two people who had found in each other something rare and precious. As evening approached, they bid farewell to their guests and rode together to the ranch that would now be their home. Nathan had spent weeks preparing for her arrival, adding feminine touches to the house that had once been solely his domain: curtains at the windows, a larger bookshelf for her collection, a rocking chair by the fireplace. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackwell," he said as he carried her over the threshold, a tradition he had insisted upon despite her laughing protests. The name sounded strange and wonderful to her ears. "It's perfect," she whispered, taking in the home they would share. All of it. That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Penelope felt the last of her walls crumble completely. In Nathan's arms, she found not just passion but a profound sense of belonging, of being truly known and accepted. The vulnerability she had feared for so long became instead a source of strength, a foundation upon which to build their shared future. Summer passed in a haze of happiness as they adjusted to married life. Penelope continued teaching, riding to and from town each day while Nathan worked the ranch. Their evenings were spent together cooking meals, reading aloud to each other, sitting on the porch as the stars emerged in the vast Montana sky. In late August, as the first hints of autumn began to touch the landscape, Penelope woke one morning feeling strangely different. At first, she attributed it to the changing season, but as days passed and the feeling persisted, accompanied by other subtle changes in her body, a suspicion began to form. She waited until she was certain before sharing her news with Nathan. On a cool September evening, as they sat before the fire after dinner, she took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "I believe," she said softly, watching his expression, "that we're going to have a baby." The wonder that spread across his face was something she would remember for the rest of her life. "A baby," he repeated, his voice filled with awe. "Our baby." "Yes," she confirmed, her own eyes bright with happy tears. "In the spring, I think." Nathan gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious material on earth. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "Both of you." The months that followed were filled with preparations and anticipation. Nathan threw himself into creating a nursery, crafting a cradle from wood he had been saving for a special project. Penelope continued teaching through the winter, though she planned to take time away after the baby's birth. The women of Redemption Creek surrounded her with advice and support, sharing wisdom passed down through generations about childbirth and infant care. Mrs. Thompson organized a gathering where each family contributed something for the baby: tiny clothes, soft blankets, practical items a new mother would need. As her body changed, growing round with the life within, Penelope often thought about how differently she had imagined her future just a year before. She had come to Redemption Creek seeking anonymity, a place to hide her wounded heart while she rebuilt her life alone. Instead, she had found community, purpose, love, and now, the promise of family. On a bright morning in early April, with the world outside bursting into spring, Penelope's labor began. Nathan sent for the midwife and remained steadfastly by her side throughout the long hours that followed. His strength and calm presence a comfort even as pain racked her body. Just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, their daughter entered the world with a strong, indignant cry. The midwife cleaned and swaddled the infant before placing her in Penelope's trembling arms. "She's perfect," Nathan whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he gazed down at their child, a tiny, red-faced bundle with a dusting of dark hair and eyes that, when briefly opened, hinted at the same clear blue as her father's. "Elizabeth," Penelope said, recalling the name they had chosen if the baby was a girl, after Nathan's mother. "Elizabeth Morgan Blackwell." Nathan nodded, too overcome to speak as he gently traced his daughter's tiny features with a reverent finger. In that moment, watching her husband and child together, Penelope felt a completeness she had never known was possible, as if a circle had been drawn around the three of them, connecting them in ways that transcended words. The years that followed brought changes to Redemption Creek and to the Blackwell family. The town grew as the railroad finally reached their valley, bringing new residents and opportunities. Nathan expanded his ranch operations, breeding horses that became known throughout the territory for their quality and training. Penelope eventually returned to teaching, bringing Elizabeth with her at first, then later establishing a proper nursery at the expanding school for the children of working mothers, an innovation that raised a few eyebrows, but ultimately proved so practical that even the most traditional townspeople came to appreciate it. Elizabeth grew into a spirited, intelligent child with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determination. She was joined 2 years later by a brother, James, and eventually by a second sister, Catherine. The Blackwell home, once a bachelor's sparse dwelling, became a place filled with laughter, learning, and love. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Nathan surprised Penelope with a special gift, a new schoolhouse for Redemption Creek, larger and better equipped than the original, with her name engraved on a brass plaque by the entrance. "The Penelope Blackwell School for Children. You built this?" she asked in amazement as he showed her through the empty building that would soon be filled with students. "With help," he admitted. "The whole town contributed, actually. They wanted to honor what you've done here, not just teaching, but caring about each child, finding ways to reach even the ones others might have given up on." Tears filled her eyes as she walked through the spacious classrooms, envisioning the possibilities. "It's wonderful, Nathan." "I don't know what to say." He took her hands in his expression serious despite the joy of the moment. "You came here hiding your heart, Penelope, afraid to let anyone see who you really were, but you couldn't hide your gift for teaching, your compassion. That's what people see when they look at you now, not whatever lies were told about you in the past, but the truth of who you are." She leaned into his embrace, thinking of the journey that had brought them to this point. "I never expected any of this when I stepped off that stagecoach," she admitted. "I was just looking for somewhere to exist quietly, to heal. I never imagined I'd find a home, a family. And I never imagined that a stubborn, guarded schoolteacher would change my life completely," he replied with a smile, brushing a kiss against her temple. "But here we are." Here they were indeed standing in the tangible proof of a decade of love and commitment, surrounded by the life they had built together. As they walked hand in hand from the new school building toward home, where their children waited with Mrs. Thompson, Penelope reflected on the walls she had once built around her heart. Those walls, constructed of fear and painful experience, had seemed necessary at the time, a fortress to protect her from further hurt. But Nathan hadn't torn them down forcefully. Instead, he had shown her that true love didn't require walls at all. It required courage, the courage to be vulnerable, to trust, to believe that what was broken could be made whole again. Under the vast Montana sky, with the man who had given her not just his child but his unwavering support and devotion, Penelope Morgan Blackwell knew that the heart she had once tried so desperately to hide was exactly where it belonged, open, full, and free.